Greetings to all our viewers and participants across the globe, and in particular on the continent, in the region, and in Zimbabwe. Tonight, this is the 8th in a series on the Policy Dialogue Forum of the Surplus Trust, a series which has attracted hundreds on Zoom over the last 3 months, thousands on Facebook and YouTube, a series that seeks to tackle the major and pertinent issues facing us, particularly in Zimbabwe. Tonight, we are looking at the Zimbabwe's land question, reflecting on the last 2 decades and pondering the challenges ahead for both Zimbabwe and South Africa. Conventionally and historically, the land question has been conflated with the colonial question. In other words, the resolution of the colonial question has meant in previous decolonization processes the resolution of the land question, simply by the departing colonial master paying out the settlers for their land, and the land becoming the repossession of the people of the country by the government on behalf of the people. We saw this happen in Kenya, Zambia, Malawi. As I said, most colonial situations, the land question was resolved in those very simple terms. However, in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, these situations had a very similar colonization process, but very comparatively different from other parts of Africa. The reason being that from the very outset, the colonial mission in both South Africa and even in Southern Rhodesia was to make these countries dominions, white dominions, such as Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. A reading of the colonial literature will show that the Union of South Africa was meant as a dominion when it was established in 1910, and the self-governing status of 1923 for Southern Rhodesia was likewise in anticipation of a white dominion status. The white dominion status, therefore, in ambition, wrote a different picture with regard to the land question. There was mass alienation of land on a grand scale, and you have in both countries, Zimbabwe and South Africa, the Land Apportionment Act in 1930 in Zimbabwe. And in short, the resolution of the land question in Zimbabwe, and no doubt in South Africa, has proved a difficult one to resolve. The Lancaster House Agreement in 1979, the Lancaster House Agreement on Zimbabwe, or the talks on Zimbabwe, began with the land question and the nationalists sought to have it resolved along the model of the decolonization precedents of Kenya and Zambia. Some of us were fortunate or unfortunate to be there. And in the first month of the talks broke down on the issue of land, the land question. And I accompanied Zingai Mtumbuka to New York to meet Andrew Young, who was the US ambassador to the UN. This was part of the program by the Patriotic Front, ZANU and ZAPU, to lobby the international community to support the nationalist cause at the Lancaster House talks. And Andrew Young, on behalf of his government, sent a telegram to the British government pledging $1 billion towards what would have been a compensation fund. I believe the British government pledged a similar amount, probably £1 billion. And the intention really was to buy out the white settlers in Zimbabwe. Then something happened. Eventually, the agreement on land was that the land issue would be deferred for 10 years after independence to 1990. The expectation then was that the land question would be resolved along the lines that I've indicated. But by that time, there was no talk anymore about a land compensation fund such as had been intended during the talks. And indeed, it is fair to say for most of us who were in government, and indeed for the leadership in particular, the land question was not top of the agenda until 2000. And as Samchia will outline, 16th of February 2000 was when the fast-track land reform program began. I'll leave you to that. But before that, I'd like just to mention that it is apparent that the land question in Zimbabwe has not been resolved yet. And some would argue it has been replicated through the fast-track land reform, in which we have, for example, in the A2 program, 15,000 beneficiaries or people who received farms formerly owned by whites and have occupied those farms free of charge on the basis of an offer letter from government. And so you have a situation where a very small minority, almost replicating or duplicating the former white farmers, as a minority who have land free of charge at the expense of the majority, 14 million. Then, of course, there's the BIPPA, which I'm sure both Zamchia and Rukuni will speak to. Also, without much ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers who will help us unpack this very complex question, the land question. We have Philani Zamchia, with the doctorate from Oxford, one of our leading public intellectuals, currently at the University of Western Cape, joining the ranks of the 75% of skilled and professional Zimbabweans outside the country. And then we have Professor Nandi Rukuni, one of our leading experts on land, and he has been part of the architecture in terms of the work done on the land issue in Zimbabwe over the years. He's an agricultural economist. He has been on many, one or two land commissions in Zimbabwe. I can't think of anyone who's more informed about the ins and outs of this complex process over the last 2 decades. I also have in the background Toko Didiza, Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development from South Africa. Toko Didiza is one of the long-standing experts on land in South Africa. In fact, I met her in her earlier life when she was Minister of Agriculture and Land in 1999, 2006, and she was a constant visitor to us when Sam Moyo was head of our land policy thing at surface and subsequently. And I have Ben Frith. Ben Frith, those of you who may have heard about him or saw him in that film on violence, the violence that accompanied land reform in 2000. Ben Frith was one of the victims of that. He almost lost his life in the process. And he remains very much an active member in the debate and, I would dare say, struggle with respect to the land issue in Zimbabwe. We're hoping to have Tembeka Uka Itobi, a brilliant lawyer. He's still at court in Pretoria, but we hope you'll join us soon. Last but not least, we have ZANU Garwe, one of our daughters. Her father was one of the first among us civil servants in 1980, the late Edmund Garwe. ZANU is now an agricultural economist with the FAO in Rome, but really engaged with the situation at home. As she says, she is so happy to be on this program, and we look forward to hearing her. So, much ado, I'll ask now Philani Zamchia to outline the problematic for us for this evening. Philani.
Thank you, Ibo, and good evening, viewers. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation tonight. Let me start by acknowledging that at land, the issue of land is very emotive, not just in Zimbabwe, but also in South Africa. And at certain times, the debate becomes so polarized that it's difficult to carve out solutions. Ibo was talking about the liberation struggle, that land was very central to the liberation struggle. I think I agree with that. But it is important to say that land was central, but it was not the only aspiration of the liberation struggle. It was about land, but it was also about human dignity. It was about basic freedoms of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. So I'm saying this because there's a tendency, from patriotic history to take the land issue and divorce it out of the wider ideals of the liberation struggle. And just to give a bit of history in terms of what have been the missed opportunities, in my view, in terms of resolving the land question, I think the first is what Ibo spoke about, which was the Lancaster House Conference that was held in 1979. I think that the former nationalists there, both ZAPU and ZANU, they made strategic compromise and agreed that in the first 10 years, they were going to protect property rights through Section 16 of the Lancaster House Constitution. And any land transfers that were going to happen were going to be based on the willing seller, willing buyer model, and was supposed to be paid in foreign currency. Then you have the first decade of independence, 1980 to 1990. It obviously had constraints, constitutional constraints. But having said that, there's a story that is not being told and debated, that Zimbabwe actually had a land redistributive program that was big by any measure in post-colonial Africa. You would realize that about 91,000 households were actually resettled. And this was a very bureaucratic, orderly, and technocratic process. Let me say during that period, it's also important to highlight that the British also paid about 44 million pounds to support the land reform process. Then fast forward to the second decade of independence, 1990 to 2000, you then have the expiry of the Lancaster House Constitution, Section 16. And there was a missed opportunity to deal with land reform. Why? Because in my view, the ruling elites were then driven by this need to adopt the structural adjustment programs. So anything to do with redistribution just fell off the radar ideologically. And land was just being put on the market. You begin to see some kind of elite capture there with about 800 connected political elites and business people who had money being able to buy land, and the rural peasantry was kind of forgotten. So 1990, it's a missed opportunity. Then 1998, there was the Land Reform Donor Conference, which had more than 48 countries that attended and pledged to give money for land reform. Then they agreed on an exception phase of about 2 years. And then what happened are the violent invasions of the former white-owned farms in 2000, which actually started on the 16th of February. And 2009, 2013, there was also a missed opportunity to deal with this issue. And now you have recently the global compensation deed. I think most of you know what it is about, but basically the idea there is to compensate the former white farmers with 3.5 billion US dollars. And this is the issue that has been topical in both the national, regional, and international media in terms of what it really means. And I would like to say that this global compensation deed has been held by President Mnangagwa as marking the final resolution of the land question. But I don't think it is that simple. I don't think it is that simple. I think what is happening here is less about constitutional compliance, because the government is saying we are complying with Section 295 of the Constitution, but it's more to do with the politics. It's the politics and not the law. This is the kind of appeasement politics which feeds into the government's re-engagement agenda. The thinking is that you have a very strong white constituents that will assist the government to campaign against sanctions internationally. Will this work? I think the answer is no. Why? First, there's no unity among the former white farmers. I hear that 5% actually said no to that. But also there's still room to reject individual compensation, even though there's an agreement, as some can actually still go to court using the Land Acquisition Act. And the second aspect there is that they did not deposit the title deeds. So the former white farm owners still hold those title deeds. What they agreed to deposit behind the scenes are just certified copies of those title deeds. And then there are also expectations behind the scenes for compensation of the actual land. And for your own information, this is not in the deed, but if you research behind the scenes, you realize that there was also valuation for the total, what is the total cost of the land that was taken, and that value is 3.2 billion. That is the value that is there. And there's an understanding that when the joint committee that is going to fundraise starts its work, they also try to fundraise for the land, not just for improvements. And the results will then determine. And for the government to think that There's then going to be re-engagement because they've paid 3.5 billion. That is, if ever they're able to raise it. I think it's a little bit reductionist. Why? Because re-engagement is also based on the respect of human rights, respect of the rule of law, and also respect of democracy. So as long as the government is reneging on that front, I do not see it being accepted in the family of nations that easily. And has the land question been resolved? No, you still have the question of labor in Zimbabwe. Remember that 1 million farm dwellers were replaced. We haven't heard anything about their compensation. In fact, the government is arguing that the farm workers must get paid from the former white farmers. I think that's missing the mark. Why? Because if we remember very well, the social relations on the commercial farms were kind of paternalistic. It was kind of domestic governments and skewed power relations. And you cannot look at a farm worker and compare with an urban industrial worker, because to a farm worker, a farm is a home. They also build their houses there, their properties. They have certain claims to land rights, but because it's not the title deed, and because it's not registered under formal system, it's usually forgotten. Then the second emerging land question is land inequalities, but this time not based on race, but based on class, based on gender, and also based on political party affiliation. We know that there are about 400 individuals that got a total of 2 million hectares of land. Then the third is a new land question of alienation and concentration. We have seen the investments that have been happening in Zimbabwe in the eastern part in Chisumbanje with the peasantry being displaced. We have seen the Chinese now moving into Chiredzi as well. And the government announced that it's going to come up with what they call special economic zones. And if we take the Zambian model, it is very clear that we are going to expect more dispossession of the rural peasantry. Then the fourth is the land tenure question. It hasn't been resolved. It's still a dual system, reproducing the colonial legacy. Those on the A1, the small farms, got permits. Those on the A2 they're trying to get 99-year leaseholds. And very few on the A1 still have those permits anyway. And what is important there is that the politicization of that land tenure still persists. And I don't think in the current context, even if you are going to give people private title deeds, they will feel secure, because the former white farmers had those private title deeds, but they were chased overnight. So the political institutions also matter. Then another emerging land question is the urban land question. Look at the informal settlements that are sprouting around the major cities. So you cannot then argue to say the land question has been resolved. And it is important also to link the land and the agrarian question. They can't be divorced when you're dealing with national issues. And both these questions need to be placed within the wider political, economic, and social processes. So you still have the agrarian question of productivity. It is very low, especially on A2 farms, a little better on A1 farms, and better in the communal areas. Never mind that the A2 farms, they are the ones who are getting the biggest amount of public resources. But those public resources are being invested in consumption, in social investments, and in political investments. We have seen Command Agriculture, $3 billion US and so forth. But I should admit that the A1 farms are actually doing much better, and they are producing better despite using their own resources. And you will have the agrarian question then of the arrested agrarian transformation. Because what you have is a kind of a predatory class that is trying to steer agrarian transformation. I don't think that we are going to see an agrarian revolution being driven by the current A2 farmers for the reasons that I've mentioned. And then as a way forward, I think it's very important, lastly, to have, to look at the Zimbabwe issue more holistically, and then try to come up with an inclusive national process that will lead to some kind of perhaps a transitional democratic development fund, of which land becomes a subset of it. So instead of just having the land fund, you then have this TDDP, the Transitional Democratic Development Fund. And then out of that, you then be able to mobilize both domestic resources and also from the British and the international community. Otherwise, the global compensation will just be another one stop that will not bring finality to the issues that I've raised. I think I should stop there and allow people to debate. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Before I turn to Professor Rukuni, as I'm chair, do you see a relationship between the Transitional Democratic Development Fund that you have mentioned and the idea of the compensation fund, with reference which I made, which was supposed to have been set up on the basis of contributions from various governments, including the US in 1979? And secondly, can you throw more light on the land redistribution program of the 80s, which saw 91,000 people resettled at the cost of 44 million pounds on the British, on the basis of willing buyer, willing seller, willing buyer. Just a few more sentences on that, so that Zimbabweans also know about it. It was there. We remember most of Makoni East, for example, the area between Rusape and Nyanga. That was resettled in the 80s, and I remember us doing a review of the Makoni East land resettlement program in the 80s. Can you just throw some light on that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that the compensation fund that you referred to, 1979, I think it could have taken more of being a decolonial fund of some sort, perhaps the Kenyan way, because if we remember in Kenya, upon attaining independence, those farmers who wanted to move out, the British, committed, actually bought them out. And the fund that I'm talking about now, I'm thinking of a broader fund to try and deal with the challenges, the crisis that Zimbabwe is facing at the moment more holistically. So perhaps you can think of the 1980s, you can make reference to the then Zimbabwe Development Fund that was there. It was not just there for land reform, but land reform was part and parcel of it. Then you come to the 1980s. Yeah, I think that the 1980s, there was a land redistribution program that was successful. I think number one, it was technocratic in this way. You actually had different kind of models. By then, I think there was model A, model B, model C, and model D, catering for the different needs of different farmers. And I think by then, the most popular was the model A, where individuals would get arable land, then some hectares for their own housing. But you also had the cooperatives and the ranges. So outside Matabeleland, of course, where there was Gukura Hundi, what the studies have shown us is that the livelihoods of the people actually improved, that were resettled in the 1980s, and that land reform was actually a positive, a very positive thing. I should also say that it wasn't violent and chaotic, as we saw from the year 2000, but definitely there were constraints here and there. I think I should end there unless viewers would like to probe more later.
No, thanks very much. We'll come back to you. Let me move now to Professor Rukuni, Mandi Rukuni. I think Zamchia has painted a solid picture of this land question, that we are far from resolving it. The myriad of questions around the land question. And even though he has recommended a way forward, it's difficult to see how in the near future we can begin even tackling this problem. Would you agree, Professor Rukuni, that the land reform program a la 2000 began less on the basis of an organized, well thought out land reform policy than the promptings, political promptings of the time, namely the defeated referendum of February 15th, 2000? Professor Rukuni.
Oh, thanks so much, Mkoma Ibo, and thanks to Pilani for that opener. I always wonder, after 4 or 5 decades, I've invested my intellect on the land reform issue globally and in Zimbabwe and Africa. I always wondered whether it is appropriate actually to always try and analyze it in terms of, did it work, it didn't work, was it good, was it bad? Because increasingly I've come to the realization that land reforms, especially radical land reforms, are not an issue of good or bad or right or wrong. They're an issue of circumstances. Life happens, life doesn't wait for good, bad, right, wrong. Things will happen. So I will try and argue that the combination of circumstances in any situation is what determines the kind of land reform that happens. And the way in which nations handle these land issues in the past, in the present, will define the social and political and economic character of that nation. Because land, although I would agree with Pilani that land is not the only thing by any means to determine the character of society, land is still a major source of identity of any nation. And by the way, land will always be political, because land always represents power, social status, prestige. I mean, that's actually the ingredients of politics. So to wish for land reforms which are not political, in my opinion, is just not realistic. I know of recent, because of this compensation deal signed with the white farmers, there's been talk of reversal of the land reform program. Well, there's no, even if government or anybody wished to reverse the land reform program, it's not possible to reverse it. There's no reverse gear, by the way. So it's once again an issue of context and just trying to clarify some issues which may not be fully understood. In this particular case, it's just miscommunication on the part of this government, because it's quite clear the amounts of land that are being talked about, amounts of land going back to indigenous or Black Zimbabweans whose land was quote unquote inadvertently compensated, and then the BIPPAs because of reasons already cited by Ibo and Pilani. So in summary, there is no end to land reforms. The land reform in Zimbabwe and South Africa will continue for decades to come, irrespective of the quality that we may want to place on it. Now, the question for Zimbabwe and South Africa really is, can land reform be a vehicle for social and economic transformation? And if we look at parts of the world where land reforms have actually triggered mass structural transformation, land reforms can actually be a massive trigger for positive transformation. It just happens that recent history, which if we go back to the First World War, Second World War period, which is our recent global history, the most successful land reforms have been in Asia. And guess what? Those reforms were, some of them anyway, were triggered by war. I mean, Japan was forced into massive land reform from a kind of a very, what do you call it? Let's just say the opportunity of a nation to move to a massive risk distribution of land in a positive way is something that both Zimbabwe and South Africa wish for. It happened in Japan, it happened in China, it has happened in many places where that process alone transforms the economy. Of course, in Africa, and especially South Africa, Zimbabwe, and so on, we know the history, and Ibo touched on it in terms of the Western nations will support land reform any day in Asia, but will oppose it every single day in this part of Africa and South America. It's history. It's part of it's what it is. Blood is thicker than water. So this global agreement with the farmers is something that needed to happen, but could have happened differently. Could have ended up with a different result. But I can tell you that I've come to the realization that there's no real value. There's no intrinsic value to land anyway. I mean, the value there is what we place on it as society. So at the end of the day, to really say there is a true singular value you can place to land that was acquired from white farmers is also a fallacy. That agreement could have turned up with $500 million, $500 million, it could have been $15 billion, is the circumstances. In this particular case, I think the attempts to come up with something that represents some initial agreement between white farmers who were dispossessed and the government is plausible. But whether in actual fact the problem is solved, we are still very far away from solving it. It's going to take a long time. And Zimbabwe is not the first country. I mean, these types of compensation packages historically can go to decades and decades. You know, and it's not only on land; it's on many other aspects of history and societal transformation. So it's unfortunate. Africa is the only continent in the world without a high-income country. Zero. Asia has got, the Americas have got, Europe has got plenty. Africa doesn't have and is not likely to have one because our best economies, such as South Africa, are still in massive middle-income traps. Massive middle-income traps because of highly dualized economies, because of narrow domestic markets which cannot sustain a massively diversified manufacturing sector. So even a country as highly developed industrially as South Africa, we still have a highly truncated economy. And as long as the economic growth rates are in 2, 3, 4%, zero, you cannot get out of a middle income trap. As long as the equilibrium rates of unemployment continue to rise for decades, you won't get out of a middle income trap. As long as the inequality in society continues to worsen. You don't get out of a middle income trap. What actually happens when inequality worsens is that the policy discourse worsens. The policy positions get more protracted, and there's greater divide in terms of potential solutions. That's why it is possible in such a highly developed economy as South Africa that you would have public policy gravitating towards land expropriation without compensation, whilst at the same time you have a highly financialized land and agricultural sector, which is just as good as you have in Australia or in Canada. Such contradictions are typical of middle income traps, and land reform programs are supposed to resolve that. So let me just sum that point up in one simple economic fact. The issue of social and economic transformation that is driven through agrarian change is not an issue of whether farms are large or small. Global research and analysis across many, many countries come up with one simple final conclusion. In those economies that are labor surplus, small farms will always be economically more efficient, not financially, but economically more efficient than large farms. In economies where labor is in short supply, large farms will be more efficient than small farms. So in the case of Zimbabwe and South Africa, there's no debate. The fact that massive numbers of people are unemployed, both rural and urban, just means that there is room to go back a few steps and re-industrialize by ensuring that you create a new rural middle class. So that global compensation indeed is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the valuation and compensation issue in Zimbabwe, because it's not only white farmers who need compensation yesterday, today, and tomorrow. There's going to be massive increase in issues and circumstances which require ordinary Black Zimbabweans in communal areas, in recently settled resettlement areas, to be compensated for various reasons. There is need, therefore, for a proper public policy that deals with issues of valuation and compensation. Today, this issue is only topical because we're talking of white farmers, and that is a political hot potato. But it's actually, if you remove the white farmers out of the equation, valuation and compensation is a big issue that requires very careful thinking, moving into the future if we are going to develop into a high income diversified economy. So agrarian transformation is the question. And I've said this before, that the one commonality between Zimbabwe and South Africa is not whether South Africa should copycat how Zimbabwe went through it, because I don't even know anybody could have predicted what happened in Zimbabwe. The issue is, in Zimbabwe, the government had an opportunity to continue with a deliberate, well thought through land reform program in the 80s and 90s, but we stopped. And the British also stopped supporting. By the 2000s, when we were entering the fast track land reform program, the government was broke, our economy was down on its knees, and all of a sudden, the only solutions left politically were to compulsorily acquire this land from the white farmers. I think South Africa is slowly gravitating towards a situation where the government will be broke one day, the economy will completely slow down, and then it will be a little bit too late. Zimbabwe did not have this kind of land reform program because Zimbabweans are dumb, because they didn't plan. It's just because the issue was left too late. And by the time, with any middle income trapped country such as Zimbabwe and South Africa and Namibia and so on. It will happen. It's just a matter of time. It's not a question of when. Land tenure, and Pilani picked on it, once again is an issue which is heavily contested in both Zimbabwe and South Africa. Once again, there's no solution to it, both intellectually, scholarly, and otherwise, because we are talking about world views. The Western world view of land tenure is completely different to the African one. The forms of ownership and how land is valued at what stage of economic development differs. That's why I would argue strongly that Zimbabwe and South Africa, for that matter, continue to maintain the multi-tenure system, an attempt to have a kind of universal antidote and universally make all land state land, or make it all communal, or make it all commercial. Zimbabwe and South Africa are still far from a situation where that can happen, because that only happens when you have complete structural transformation and 95% of the population is urbanized. Then you can start homogenizing land tenure. But right now, as we speak, it doesn't matter how advanced the one part of the economy is, as long as the other part is not developed, land won't be a property that can be traded. It continues to be family land. It continues to be a form of identity. So rebuilding a rural financial services sector becomes important in being able to link the previously neglected communal small family farm sector into a modern economy. So finally, I would say there are no right or wrong answers. I'm sorry to say. Their answers are appropriate to the situation. The pace of land reform is more important to me than anything else. If you wait for the right moment, when all the ducks are lined up correctly, you end up where Zimbabwe ended up. And I would urge the South Africans to stop wishing for some utopia type of land reform program. It's not gonna come, because the society is already heavily fractured. The discord and structural faults are too huge to expect a nice heavenly solution. Okay, it's not going to happen. So get on with it and just make sure that you learn by doing. I've put a simple formula sometime when I was talking to colleagues in South Africa, that it's not a mathematical formula, it's a philosophical formula. That the pace of land reform must be equal or exceed any political justification for farm invasions. And if land reform is so slow that the bulk of society believes ultimately a chaotic one is better than nothing, then it will happen. But keep moving. The situation in South Africa is probably where Zimbabwe was in 1996, 7, 8. By 2000, I can tell you by 2000, the major change for me individually was that up until 2000, I was considered an expert. I was listened to here and there. By 2000, I'd become irrelevant. It was not time to listen to experts anymore. Experts and technicians become irrelevant, and politicians take over and run with it. I remember bumping into the late President Mugabe at some graduation ceremony, and he looked at me and said, "I know what you're thinking, Prof. But there's no room for the kind of thing that you talked about in your land commission reports. We are at war. So we will fight the war first, and then we'll implement your reports, recommendations later." So I'll just close that by saying there's absolutely no way I see a liberation movement such as ANC or ZANU PF or Frelimo allowing, whether through law or through hook and crook, allowing any kind of transition where they are going to be booted out of power, and they have not somehow dealt with the land question. So the issue is, where are they going to be when that ball drops? And in the case of Zimbabwe, we know what happened. In the case of South Africa, we don't know what's going to happen. But the fact that the ANC 2 years ago already mooted land expropriation without compensation means that they're running out of economic solutions. Now, political solutions loom large. This is time to move on. Thank you very much.
Before you let you go, Mandy, as usual, very fascinating. No reverse gear. What is it that's no reverse gear about? What is it that we've done so far that cannot be reversed? But more specifically, can you throw some more light on this BIPPA and the global compensation deed, please, for our viewers and for Zimbabwe to understand? You did say it's largely an outcome of, the discussion, the debate so far is largely an outcome of miscommunication on the part of government. I agree, but maybe you could just add some more light to it.
Well, there's the positive side and the negative side. The positive side is some level of realization on the part of both the white farmers and the government of Zimbabwe that we are on our own. There's no world, there's no global solution that's going to come on the table here. In the past, when I was involved in these discussions, it was very clear that although Western countries, they've always supported the plight of white farmers who lost their land, they also don't see any justification, in spite of the Lancaster House possibility then, the Lancaster House possibility then that Ibo spoke about was our best chance. That was the time when maybe the UK and the Americans could have pushed $2 billion into the kitty. Today, there is no Western country whose foreign office or donor pot of money can fish out that kind of money for white farmers in a country where there's millions of people hungry, cannot even feed themselves. There's no money for that. So the 3.5 billion would have to come out of some structured financial arrangement. Maybe it can be supported by some donor financing, but the donor financing is not going to be the lead there. So the positive side is, yes, the white farmers realize no one is going to give this government the money, either for the improvements or for the land. So let's sign this agreement with this government and create some goodwill and hope that some financial engineering will happen. So, well, let's give them a chance. How long it will take to get the 3.5 billion, over how many years, and no one can say at this point in time. The negative side is some of the stuff that Pilani was talking about, in a sense that an over expectation that this will somehow be magical and the problem will go away. It won't go away, actually. And in addition, on the negative side is that white farmers are not the only people who lost out in this massive drop in the economy. Every Zimbabwean suffered one way or another. People lost their pension funds, they name it. It was mayhem on the whole economy. Compensating white farmers is a political pressure point, not that is truly the most justifiable thing to do for Zimbabweans. Every Zimbabweans needed some level of compensation. And then some would even argue that the compensation issue can be dragged all the way back 150 years. I won't go into that because it's an open-ended thing. All I'm saying is that these kinds of agreements happen because of political and economic realities of the time, like the time we have now. We are in a weak position as a country and as a government, so our negotiation strength was not as strong as it could be if we had already developed our economy through the land reform program and we were already a 50, 60, $100 billion economy, it would be a completely different agreement that would have been signed.
Thanks, Mandy. Thanks very much indeed. We'll come back to you, of course. I'm sure there are many questions coming up already for you. Let me turn to Ben Frith. Ben, unmute yourself. Ben, can you throw some light on this BIPPA debate in the first instance? What's it all about?
Thank you very much, Ivo, for allowing me on. Are you hearing me all right? I hope so. I just quickly want to fill in a couple of gaps, if I may, Ivo. Just going back to where I was intimately involved in what actually took place on the land in the last 20 years with the land invasions, because I think it's very relevant to where we are today. And something that hasn't actually been talked about is the fact that in 1999, the opposition was formed, the Movement for Democratic Change, and a number of speakers have mentioned the 16th of February 2000 as the date of land invasions beginning. And just to remind everyone, at that time there was a referendum, and one of the things in the referendum was that land should be able to be acquired and given out for free, so no compensation for the land. And you'll remember that what happened is that the people of Zimbabwe rejected that new constitution, and there was an election coming up in June of that year 2000, and as soon as the president realized that the people had rejected his new constitution, he realized that they would reject him as the president of Zimbabwe. And so what then happened on the 16th of February was that the land invasions began. And as Professor Rukuni rightly said, President Mugabe was not one to listen to good sense. He was not one to listen to the fact that it was being done in a wrong manner. And he said to Professor Rukuni, "We are at war." And as a farmer through that time, living on a farm, we experienced what it was like to be at the receiving end of President Robert Mugabe's war. And we saw people being murdered, and we saw a lot of violence being meted out. I was beaten up on quite a few occasions. My father-in-law was actually killed. And what then happened in 2005 that also hasn't been mentioned was that Amendment number 17 to the Constitution was brought in, which was the clause that had been rejected by the people in the referendum. And with that, land was able to be acquired for free without paying farmers. And we as a family took the opportunity at that time to go to the Supreme Court to try and get a case heard regarding rule of law issues, basic rule of law issues in relation to the way that the acquisition was taking place. And we didn't know at that time what was going to happen. My father-in-law was arrested at that time for allegedly being on his farm illegally, being in his home illegally, farming illegally under Amendment 17 to the Constitution. And so we ended up being able to go to the SADC Tribunal, which had been formed as a human rights court within the Southern African Development Community. And it was quite a battle. And during that battle, 2 weeks before our main hearing, we were abducted and very severely tortured, and they tried to get us to withdraw from the SADC tribunal. And anyway, we managed to get our hearing in July 2008, and we got our judgment in November 2008, 28th of November 2008. And this was a very key part of the whole issue of the land reform program that hasn't yet been talked about in this meeting, in that the SADC tribunal made a judgment to say that what was happening on the land, on the farms in Zimbabwe, was against the SADC treaty. It was against international law. It was against human rights. It was against the rule of law. And these are very fundamental things that I believe are absolutely critical to our understanding of where Zimbabwe currently is. One of the fundamental things I believe to do with Zimbabwe's former success as an agricultural nation was the issue of property rights, where farmers were able to use their title deeds to lever finance from the banks. And as a result of that, 10,000 dams in Zimbabwe were built. There was massive development that was able to take place. The banks were able to, financial institutions were able to come in a very major way. And we did see a fast developing country as a result of those property rights. But what President Mugabe's statement, "We are at war," said was that we need to control the land. We need to control the people on the land. The invasions that took place on the land were to make sure that those people in the referendum who had voted against the new constitution were subdued. And what we saw after the 16th of February 2000 was not a single opposition rally from the Movement for Democratic Change able to take place on a single commercial farm up until today, up until 2020. And part of the election strategy, the major election strategy, is to bring all those people into fear and all those people into a level of
Sorry,
dependence
Ben.
on the party.
Sorry, Ben. Well, that's very interesting. Can you just focus on BIPPA for a while? Let us know what BIPPA is all about. BIPPA.
Okay, so the bilateral investment treaties that have been signed with Germany, with Holland, with Switzerland, with various other countries are there so that investors from overseas are able to go to arbitration, international arbitration, and then be able to get an award if it's deemed that the Zimbabwe government has destroyed their investment. So what we've seen is the Dutch farmers go to a court arbitration in Paris. We've also seen Heinrich von Petzold, a German national, go to an arbitration. This is under the World Bank, and it was the court that was chosen was in Washington, D.C. And in those cases, the Zimbabwe government lost. And in Heinrich von Petzold's case, they lost very badly. It was $200 million or thereabouts that was owed by the Zimbabwe government to this one German national for all his investments. And they were very major investments, all since 1980, all under the ZANU PF government. And those investments had been destroyed or taken away from this investor. And so what the Zimbabwe government recognizes is that certain people have more rights than other people simply because their countries of origin have got a bilateral investment treaty with Zimbabwe. And this is why those nationals have got special treatment, whereas Zimbabwean citizens are treated as though they do not have such rights, which is a difficult thing. And what we're seeing at the moment, just over last weekend, we saw Martin Krobela being kicked off his property where he was growing tobacco, farming cattle, employing lots of people, and 25 policemen pitched up on his farm. And by the end of the weekend, he was turfed out of his house. He's now living with relatives, and that whole property now, he is unable to produce on. And this is going on all the time. Some of you may have seen.
But how many farms would you say are involved in the BIPPA agreement? What's the number of farms?
It's not.
66, some say 166.
Yeah, it's not an awful lot, because unfortunately, the main countries of foreign nationals, so Britain, for example, the Zimbabwe government didn't sign an agreement with the UK, didn't sign an agreement with the USA, didn't sign an agreement with South Africa until much more recently. So nationals from those countries are unable to go to international arbitration.
Okay. Okay, you want to say something else before we move on to Wadzanai?
Yeah, just on the issue of property rights, Ibo, you know, this is fundamental, I believe, for our communal people. It's fundamental for the newly resettled people. It's fundamental to anyone who wants to be a farmer. Property rights are fundamental. And at the moment, we do not have property rights of any real nature in Zimbabwe, where the ownership of the property can be transferred to someone else or sold. The value of the property that people are on is not able to be realized. And as a result, what we've got is dead capital in Zimbabwe. And because we've got dead capital, we are not seeing dams being built. We're not seeing the investment that we need. We're not seeing big exports of agricultural produce. We're not seeing food production in a major way. In fact, we've got, by Christmas, I believe this year, nearly 10 million people that will need food aid yet again from the international community. And, you know, as a business community, forget about the emotive issue of land. As a business community, the dead capital needs to be made into live capital so that business can thrive. And when business thrives, everything else can thrive. And the social ministries, education, health, all the infrastructure in the country can then start to develop as the country industrializes, because this dead asset becomes alive. And that's what we need in Africa. That's what we need in Zimbabwe. That's what we need to have high income countries start to appear on our continent. It's not because we're useless people, not because we haven't got the resources. It's not because of all the excuses we like to make. It's because our governments don't like to give individual people, whether they be white or black or pink or purple, proper to its full potential and allow the human being, the individual human being, to realize his or her God-given potential.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Ben. I'm sure there'll be questions to you later. Wadzanai? Wadzanai, are you there? My dear Wadzanai.
Okay. I was trying to unmute myself and the host wasn't letting me. Hello, everyone.
Welcome, Wadzanai.
I think for me, there's three issues that I want to bring up. The first on land is the fact that the changing nature of land designation. So if we look at companies being given mining rights, for example, to land that is still to be given tenure rights, etc. That is one of the issues that we need to bring up in land. So there's this, what do we call it? This gray area about land in Zimbabwe currently, where you can, when you change it from the designation of being farming land to mining, etc. How does that work? How does it work in the context of still people holding these pieces of paper that are not saying that you have 99 years to farm the land, etc. And this is why people aren't investing in land, because they have no security of tenure. I think the second thing I wanted to talk about is these which Mr. Fries touched on, are these, we've normalized waves of displacement. So, and it's no longer a racial thing anymore. It can be class, it can be political. And with each wave of displacement, with each new person coming onto this land, we get a further disenfranchisement of farm workers who are also Zimbabweans, who also have invested in land. And if we go back to the first speaker and Prof. Rukuni, these are also people who have considered it their land as well. And this is an issue that's both here and in South Africa, because in South Africa, even though there's an act which says that you cannot evict a farm worker who's been on a piece of land over 60, you can actually go to court and evict them. So, so in South Africa, where they have the legal recourse for private land or for private land, evictions take place, which are displacements for people, for farm workers, and also they can use the legal system to change the nature of the land. So they can change from saying that it's a farm to a game farm, and they can then say that they have to evict the current workers because they don't fit the labor requirements of their new farm. So we have to really look at the designation of land, and also we need to look at looking after the people who are displaced within the land issue. We were talking about how Zimbabwe was progressing economically when the white farmers were there. But look at the farm workers. I mean, I can't remember what he called it, a paternalistic system. The farm workers, even if they were compensated, have no idea about how to utilize funds, etc., because they've always been looked after by a parent who was, quote unquote, the farmer who was looking after them. So they never touched cash as cash. They were always looked after in a form of paternalistic fashion. And then we have to think about the third thing that I wanted to bring into this discussion was the fact that with this year, with 2020 and COVID, let's just put aside COVID, with climate change happening, when we look at the fourth question, which was agrarian transformation, economic recovery, and political stabilization. If we're going to look at economic recovery, we really have to put into context what we're doing to the environment when we allow large-scale tracts of land to have large machinery on them, and we're destroying the environment. I saw a video the other day on the Sabe River, where they've allowed some Chinese investors to look at to change the nature of the land using large-scale machinery. So we really have to look at the broader context if we're going to look at the agrarian transformation, and if we're going to look at our countries as they are. In South Africa, I think the biggest issue for me, and I worked with the Ministry of Agriculture between 2013 and 2016, was the issue of land in communal areas. Because there really is no legislation. I think there's a temporary act that exists, the Interim Protection of Land Rights Act number 31 of 1996, and this was supposed to transition from the Communal Areas Act into a policy or legislation. So there really is very little law governing or guiding the access to communal land in South Africa, and when we talk about communal land, we then come to all the issues around access. And we come to the issues around women accessing land and women having a right to land. I think it's only in this decade, actually, where the customary act in South Africa allows a woman to inherit land through her husband or from her husband, which is, I think, the Customary Marriages Act. I'm not a lawyer. Let me make that very, very clear. So I really think that in South Africa, and I'm not sure about the communal land in Zimbabwe. I don't know enough about it, but I did work with the communal land in South Africa. The communal land is held in trust by the minister, but there are no title deeds. It's really subject to a chief or a politician, or even a greedy white or black farmer who can change the nature of communal land. And this has resulted in the displacement of people from communal land. So I think one of the things that's very important about addressing the land issue is re-looking at the designation of land in these two countries. Who actually has what have investors done? Because Zimbabwe has had a wave of different investors, even since the land reform, what we call the fast-track land reform situation. I'm not talking about the redistribution in the 1980s. And we have to look at what these waves of displacement and the changes in the designations have done. And does this land, and can this land actually do what it needs to do, especially given the increasing desertification of land, the fact that tobacco has completely taken all the nutrients out of the soil. And so we have to start looking at really, even if we do get land, even if we finally resolve this question, will that land still be arable? Will we be able to feed the host of people that we need to feed? And given the current COVID situation, there's no country right now, west, east, whatever, looking wherever, they don't have the money to invest in countries like Zimbabwe, South Africa, or Namibia, because they have to concentrate on their own people. And so the question of putting out a global fund and trying to get it resourced is not going to happen. And I really think we need to look at this investment window that's been calling investors to come from all over the land, from all over the world, to invest in large-scale farming, etc. The Brazil model of getting as much food out to as many people as possible, and how many people actually, and what does the title look like for those companies that are coming in, who have tax windows for 5 years or 10 years, so the money doesn't even actually stay in Zimbabwe, and are these large-scale investors, are they required to make any improvements to the community around them and things like that? So I think if we're going to look at forward-looking and economic transformation and things like that, we have to look at these issues around whatever the form of title, whatever the form that title is going to look like. Because right now, this little piece of paper, a farmer on an A1 or A2 farm can't take that paper to the bank and get a loan against it because they have no security of tenure. So what do we do in the event that, how do we get past that? How do we get banks investing in agriculture? how do we get South Africans interested in agriculture? Because it's one thing to talk about land and land reform as a political issue. It's quite a different thing. Zimbabwe has been an agrarian society. So I can go back to my father and my father's father, etc. My father's father was an extensionist. My dad was an agriculturalist, all those things. But in South Africa, this does not exist. The South Africans were not an agrarian society. So when we talk about land, what are we talking about in a South African context? Because you then have to put in the social capital for people to be able to learn how to farm. And all those issues around that. So those were the areas that I think I wanted to touch on, and to broaden the discussion beyond the political discussion, to really look at the economics of land, looking at communal land, which is a hugely emotional issue in South Africa, and really looking at political will to really address these land issues in a pragmatic manner, as opposed to in the emotional manner in which we've been looking at. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wadzai. Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Before I take questions from the floor, I'd like to put the two issues to Philani Zamchia and Professor Rukuni. Wadzai has raised the issue of women land rights, climate change, and urban land. And Ben Frith has raised the question of property rights. Could have some responses initially? Philani Zamchia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ivo. I want to say, I was talking about new land inequalities that are based on gender. So I agree with Wadzanai that women were marginalized, especially during the fast track land reform program, because of the violent nature. But if you look at the institutions that were involved, they were also quite patriarchal, those that were involved in terms of allocating land. And look at the Chausu Tete report of 2003. Only 12% of those who got land were women, like who had the land registered in their own names. That's 12%. Even if you look at one of the scholars who is very optimistic about fast track, Ian Skuns, from his study, it's also quite low. Sam Moyo delayed, it was 19%, which I know to be the highest. So there has been marginalization there. And I know that there are attempts now to ensure that as spouses, they both register. But it's one thing to have it in policy. It's also difficult to implement it in a very patriarchal society. So you have seen this continuation of gendered exploitative reproduction and production relations on the farms. And yeah, I got the point about property rights in two ways. I think property rights, Zimbabwe has the Bill of Rights, and I think property rights are enshrined in there. That's why I was also talking about the rule of law and so forth. But where I disagree is this notion that if you give people the private title, then it's going to be automatic that they are going to get bank loans. I don't think it's going to work like that. I don't think the financial world operates like that. You'll see that even with those private title deeds, it will still be very difficult, especially for those poorer farmers to be able to gain access to loans. I think what you need more is secure tenure. I agree with Mandy there that multiple forms of tenure can still work in Zimbabwe. The private title deed is not the magic like the bullet. It's actually going to be messy if you apply it on communal areas as well as on A1. But what I was questioning is this dual nature between the A1 and the A2. I'm not sure if there's another question. I think I'll defer the question on climate change to Mandiwamba.
Mandy, can you come in? And also on issue of property rights, and there's still the unanswered question, who will pay for compensation? And maybe I can put the question to all of you, for the four of you so far. There is this burning question about the fact that only 15,000 people are beneficiaries of the A2 scheme, implying thereby that they receive this land free, and yet the former owners of those lands, those farms, are to be compensated or are being compensated, and still hold the title deeds. That the A2 farmer is unlikely to ever own that farm. Is there a possibility, as was recommended by the Surplus Trust through Samoyo in 2000, the idea of having the people actually buy those farms from government, A2 farms, and thereby get title? Mandy?
Yeah, thanks, Ibo. Let me start with that last point. Because people, my take on the A2 farms is very simple. If you go back to 1890, when we had the pioneer column come in, and land was distributed also free of charge to hundreds of white people who were prepared to settle under the British South Africa Company. Between 1890 and about 1905, a lot of that land is actually equivalent to today's A2. These were cronies who got land. They were not serious farmers. They were not interested in farming, actually. It was just a starting point for them. They were into all sorts of other things, prospecting for gold and trading. Remember, they would buy a truck and then they buy produce from black farmers on their farms, the Kefa truck story. So this is what happens in this type of situation when land reform or land acquisition is driven by a section in society which has a clear agenda. By 1908, the British South Africa Company realized that mining was not a big deal in Zimbabwe, and they were charting now an agriculture agenda. And land ownership started shifting. I mean, they established a land bank around 1911 after that. So land which was originally held for speculation started shifting to serious investors and farmers. The same needs to happen to A2 land. Most of that land was free land, just like the white pioneer column did, free land to people who are supporting the movement. And that land today, if you're going to use market mechanisms to get it back into production, you just need, I mean, I was jokingly saying to somebody in government the other day, just give me $50 million. I'll buy back most of that land. I can tell you that. Some of that land I can buy some of those offer letters for $5,000 Ibo, I can tell you that. Maybe some for $20,000. And then if you had a land bank arrangement, which would be the proper answer to this, then the land bank would actually ensure that the land is eventually sold out to serious investors who have capacity to invest and produce. So there's nothing unusual about a political situation where land is rapidly acquired from an existing lower class by a new ruling class who will hang on to it for as long as they can for speculative purposes. In this particular case, I think the way out is for the government to simply decide we establish a land bank, and all that land then goes on the balance sheet of the land bank, and ensure that they pay for it, including a ground rent annually, and ensure that financing of that land is related to production and productivity. So if I move on to the gender issue, it's pervasive. The gender bias is across the board. And don't be fooled that it's only Africans who are patriarchal and have monopolized land. Even the white colonials were just as bad. When I looked at statistics in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Zambia, even with title deed land, it's mostly men. All tenure systems across the board and across all racial lines, we are all male chauvinists. So it's made worse in Zimbabwe and South Africa because of a dual legal system. This dual legal system is the biggest challenge in addressing the problem, because the contradictions that exist between African worldviews of property and inheritance, which is not captured in statutory law and in English common law that we use, and Roman Dutch law, which is the statutory law. So if I can just summarize that for you based on the work I did way back on the Land Tenure Commission. Just on inheritance, which is the biggest challenge. Under African customary law in Zimbabwe, the eldest son does not inherit property. There's no such a thing in customary law. Eldest sons inherit the name. They are the new father of the family. Property is not inherited. You inherit responsibility. And once the responsibilities are allocated, the youngest brother will look after the mother. The eldest sister will look after the dependent children who are still going to school. Then assets are inherited and allocated on the basis of the responsibilities that have been inherited. But English common law says the eldest son is heir apparent. So today you have African customary law, which was the most egalitarian piece of inheritance law, subverted, because myself as an eldest son can now go to the master of the High Court and be declared heir apparent, and then dislodge all the people who are dependent, who under customary law are supposed to look after. Okay, this problem is not going to go away through all these gender mainstreaming programs. This problem will go away when Africans go back to understanding we are Africans. We're not Europeans. We're not Chinese. We'll never beat Chinese or Americans at being what they are. We need to go back to our customary law, analyze it back, and interpret it in modern terms. How do people inherit responsibilities so that if it's family land, that land will continue to look after dependent members of the family. But as it is, we take advantage of it's the worst of both worlds. We go and demand property because now we are individualizing what is supposed to be family land. So deal with the dual legal system. And in terms of land tenure, I think Pilani put it beautifully. It's not the type of tenure that matters. It is those 8 rights which have to be safeguarded and defined, clearly defined, recognized on the ground, and then protected. Then it doesn't matter what tenure system it is. It can be commercially viable. It doesn't. The land itself does not have to be commercial property, especially in a poor country. If you're a low-income country where the majority of your people are low income, land will never be property. It's only when you move to some levels of middle class that a large proportion of the population will have land as property. Because even as a middle class people like us speaking here today, how often do you sell your property? How often do you sell your land? How often do you sell your house? Maybe never in a lifetime. So the land and property is not itself the commercial value. It represents value which you can convert into loans. So if you are in the low income groups, like in A1 communal areas, land is not property. Please don't confuse that. Land is a form of identity. It's where you belong. It only becomes property when it's no longer necessary to look after families on that piece of land. So I think we have got a long way to go when it comes to this really crazy dualistic, pluralistic legal system, which is not leading us anywhere.
Thanks, Mandy. Thanks very much. There was some question there. Tony Rila? Tony?
Thank you. This has been extremely interesting. One of the things that concerns me and some of my colleagues is that when we start talking about land, we have to talk about some real situations. And one of the real situations that Zimbabwe will face, undoubtedly, in the very near future, is going to be the severe effects of climate change. And the severe effects of climate change are going to dramatically change where people can live and how they can live comfortably. I'll give you a personal example. I just came back about a week and a half ago from the Savi Conservancy, which is a very nice place for wild animals, and it's extremely difficult place to farm without very high level inputs. You can survive there if you've got irrigation and you can grow oranges and stuff like that. But if you don't, and I saw all these people who've been resettled in the Savi Conservancy in an extremely inhospitable place, where it is extremely difficult to grow crops, never mind the wild animals. Even if you didn't have the wild animals, it's going to be very difficult. So it is undoubtedly clear that the science tells us in the very near future, Zimbabwe is going to face climatic stress. And that's going to change where people can live and have decent futures. And that is going to affect the nature of land. So when we talk about A2 and A1, these are all very nice around property rights and let's be a middle income country and all that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, where are people going to live and how? And Mandy's raised the point that, you know, one of the things you can do when you have surplus labor is to host people on very small farms. Well, it seems to me that would be inimical to the idea of people owning large farms in areas that are likely to have high rainfall. So in the midst of all of this, is another crunchy question is that we're going to have to address the whole nature of where people live. Whatever property rights you talk about or what commercial value, we're going to have to start thinking about a policy that will incorporate that. And that seems to me is missing from this debate. And it links also to what ZANU says. And it's very clear that all the evidence says that the people who are going to get hit hardest in climate change are going to be the rural people, obviously, and rural women and their families. They're going to be hit really hard. And this is not really in the debate about land reform. It's in some other place. We did a little bit of research recently on the basis of questions that were asked in the Afrobarometer and asked Zimbabweans what they thought about climate change. They had 4 simple questions. The striking thing was the difference in understanding about climate change between urban and rural people. The access to media and information meant that urban people had a fairly good idea about climate change, but the rural people thought about weather, but they had no concept of climate change. And I'm interested what the people here have to say about how we deal with this land question in the face of the climate change onslaught. Thank you, Iba.
Tony, we're running out of time now, so I'm going to ask the 4 panelists. Sorry, the minister couldn't make it. Last minute, she was called by the president, Minister Togo Dijiza. She couldn't make it, and our lawyer friend in Pretoria is still held up. So I'm going to ask ZANU to start, answer the question or comment on Tony Rila's submission, and also summarize your submission in terms of the main question before us, where do we stand with the land question in Zimbabwe in particular. ZANU, then Ben Frith, Mandy, and last but not least, Zamchia.
I think Tony, yes, hi. I think Tony put it in a nutshell. If we don't look at the issues of climate change and the changing nature of the type of land use, which we will be forced to, whether we want to or not. The rural poor and the rural population is going to be very affected. And that's why I brought up the issue of climate change, the issue of COVID and financing, because there's much less money in the world for development. There's much less money in the world. I mean, the British government has changed, what did it used to be called? The Development Agency. And incorporated it into foreign affairs, and really changed the issue of the percentage of money that goes into development funds. So I think for me, to look at the forward looking and to summarize my contribution, I think that we need to look at the land designation issues. What is actually going on the ground with land? Because we're assuming that we've stayed in a static environment, but we haven't. There's been large-scale, investment in other issues. There's been changing of the land designations. So we need to look at that. We also need to really look at the question of the disenfranchisement of people who have been displaced on land. And my biggest issue is the farm workers, but there are a lot of other people who are being displaced from land, and we have to look at those issues. So I think going forth, we need to broaden the scope. We need to firstly get even a snapshot of what the land use pattern is right now, and superimpose that on a map that is showing the changes in the climatic conditions. And then from there, we can begin to talk about solutions, pragmatic solutions, even before we go to the policies and the politics, etc., and legislation. We need to look at pragmatic issues about, we may need people to move, and people will move because of climate change. They will be. I mean, Cyclone Idai is a perfect example of what we have to look forward to in terms of people being displaced, land, large land changes, etc. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Wadanai. Thank you very much indeed. Benfrith?
Hi, Ivo. I think as far as climate change is concerned, what tends to happen amongst farmers who are dynamic and able to adapt is that they find ways of making a plan. And when you have got property rights, you end up with a situation where farmers actually find the right crops to grow, the right ways to grow it, the right irrigation schemes to use. And whether you're in Israel, which was desert in 1948, and we saw the desert blossom, or whether you're in Zimbabwe and rainfall may be changing, human beings have got this innate ability to adapt and develop systems that make the best use of the land, given the soils and the rainfall that they have got, and that's what we saw. That's what we have seen in the past. There wasn't a single body of water in the whole of Zimbabwe just over 100 years ago. 10,000 dams were built on the back of property rights, on the back of people being able to go to a financial institution because they had title deeds and were able to use those title deeds to lever finance from those financial institutions to build dams, to put in irrigation schemes, to look at long-term investment on the land that they were on. And I think that's what you see all over the world, is farmers have got this innate ability to adapt, but they need long-term security, they need property rights. And those that fail will sell off their land to someone that is willing to take a chance and try and succeed. And we see that all over the world. We saw that in Zimbabwe pre-2000 as well. There was a big fallout of farmers that couldn't adapt, and then others who were adapting able to take up the slack and make farms that were failing into successful farms, employing people, producing crops, and being an asset to the country rather than a liability.
Ben, thank you very much. I see I've mastered the technology after all. Mandy?
Thanks so much, Ibo. I mean, when I listen to Tony talk about climate change and then Wazi chipped in with COVID-19, I was taken aback because they're now talking about real fundamental issues of life and transformation. So just today, so I'm going to have to end on a philosophical note because that's where they've taken me, those two summary statements. One of my favorite old guys, older than me that is, one of my favorite ones, just said to me today, one of the most interesting jokes. He said, if you want God to really laugh, if you want God to have a big laugh, what you do is show her your plan, okay? Because life is I mean, the universe is not constructed to respect all our beautiful plans. It is intended to create new challenges and challenge us to create new solutions. So at the end of it all the problems we have, including our land problems, are not because of the evil, this evil, that. It's just an absence of higher thought and on our part. We get caught up in emotional issues. We use partial solutions. So the long and the short is land in the long run does not belong to anybody. It's there to share. Land is there to share with the trees, with the animals. It's there to share with everybody else. And because of climate change, COVID, and similar challenges in future, who knows where your great-great-grandchildren are going to end up. Some of the land won't be habitable. Some of the cities won't be habitable. And what's important is understanding that the construction of society has become too constipated. This industrial, predictable understanding of life, this Newtonian idea that we can predict everything and plan everything, well, God is having a good laugh. So what we need are people who are open-minded. We need societies who promote open-mindedness and understanding that solutions are not intended, or rather you can't change history. We are here, in fact, we're not here to change history. We are here to create new history. So the challenge that Zimbabwe and South Africa has is to rise above this very, very limited understanding of how to create a new society based on our colonial history. In fact, we are just products. We are still in colonial, what you might call trauma. We don't even know how to think for ourselves. We don't even know how to resolve these issues in an African way. And that's my appeal, is to say, let's not think solution is in the past. It will never be in the past. That's why I keep saying, forget about reversing land reform. Talk about creating a new society. How do we do it? And this is where I really think, if you're going to continue with this conversation, Ibo, we need to go to. Otherwise, it's interesting politically to kick around and blame this one and blame that one. But I don't think we're exercising our highest capacity to deal with these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Mandy. As usual, inspiring. Thanks very much. Tejara Zamchia, you get the first word, you'll have the last word.
Okay. Thank you, Ibo. I was thinking that perhaps Minister Didiza was going to come. So I just want to first say, to make a little bit of a reflection also on South Africa, to say that South Africa is also facing similar problems in my view. And they have adopted like a three-legged land reform process. The first one is land redistribution. The ANC had a target of transferring like 30% of what owned farms by 1999. But up to now, they have only kind of transferred 10% of that land. So the process there has also been slow. They also have land restitution. And if they continue on the current pace, some calculations show that it's gonna take 709 years to complete these processes. Then in terms of the third one, the land tenure reform, South Africa still doesn't have a substantive, Communal Land Rights Act. The act that was there was ruled unconstitutional. The farm workers were dispossessed more in the first decade of independence than the last decade of apartheid. And there are debates about expropriation without compensation. Of course, the ANC doesn't have 2/3 majority in parliament. So they will need the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, to partner with them for them to push it through. But their difference is the EFF wants nationalization and the ANC is on the other end. So I thought maybe for our viewers who wanted to hear a little bit more about South Africa, that could be helpful. But I don't think expropriation without compensation is going to be the answer to the problems that South Africa is facing vis-a-vis its land question. So you still have a very raw land redistributive question there in South Africa. And just to conclude on Zimbabwe, as I said, the global compensation deed to me was more, it's a political strategy. And I don't agree that it's all about the need to comply with the Constitution. The government has not been complying with the Constitution, even in situations where it does not need money. So it's part of the re-engagement strategy to try and re-engage the West, to try and bring in the much needed capital to Zimbabwe. And I don't think it is going to work on its own. As I said, that is not just about land, it's also about other liberation kind of, aspirations. It's about human rights, as I said. So there's need for a more holistic approach to deal with the Zimbabwe crisis. I also just want to say there are still multiple land questions in the country that needs to be addressed. The issue of the land inequalities I spoke about based on this, the class divide, the A2 farms that we're talking about. Yeah, they are between maybe 15, if you want to be generous, only 20,000 people, Zimbabweans, most of them linked to the ruling party, but also others are part of the military elite, the commissioned commanders, who have these vast tracts of land where they capture the public resources, but use those for consumption and not reinvesting in production. So that's a sector that needs to be looked at. And having said that, I don't think that that means that land reform cannot be a vehicle for transformation. Land reforms can be vehicles for socio-economic transformation and actually must be supported. But what is important is to note that for land reform programs to be successful, you also need to have the right economics in place. You need to have the right politics in place. I know we have been debating about these tenure systems and so forth. And I say that as long as you have the kind of politics that you have in Zimbabwe, the politics of patronage, and you have these partisan institutions that administer land, there's no guarantee that even if you get a title deed today, then the problem is over. And there's also no guarantee that the economy can be fixed, or whatever brilliant plans you come with on agrarian revolution are going to work. So let us have a more holistic approach to dealing with the Zimbabwean problem. The land question, yes, but also issues to do with human rights, rule of law, democracy are also central for the nation going forward. And this is not just about Zimbabwe, it's also about South Africa, because both countries have former liberation movements running the countries. And don't take this lightly that this land issue is done, that that there's even unanimity within the ruling party ZANU PF. ZANU PF is actually divided to the core because of the current politics. The global compensation deed is within the context of President Mnangagwa's Zimbabwe's open for business philosophy, you know. And there are deep divisions within an already fractured ZANU PF. And this is actually a serious issue for Zimbabwe that can actually, if not handled well, can fast track Zimbabwe into another possibly disastrous event like the military coup we saw 17 November 2017. So I was to emphasize the connectivity of the politics, of the economics, the land question, and the agrarian question of transformation. Thank you, Ibo, for tonight.
No, thank you very much indeed. Before I thank you, our two panelists and our two discussants, I just want to say that, well, like most of the topics we have flagged in this series, they're never conclusive. We shed a bit of light on them. And I think the two panelists in particular, Zamchia and Lukuni, as modest as they want to claim, they are experts in this field. Zamchia shows that we have the land question is far much more complex. It's become much more complex. It's more than duplicated. You mentioned the amazing figure of 400 people who own 2 million hectares of land. The new land barons, you can call them that, who are made up mainly of the party, military, bureaucratic elite who own that. And that's a land question looming at us tomorrow. We have also learned a lot by comparison with South Africa, even though Professor Kuni has sought to comfort us that there's no good or bad land reform. Land reform is driven by politics in most cases. It's a class issue. And yet there's no reverse gear either. We can seek as intellectuals, as policy analysts, as policy makers, to refine and mediate political processes so that to ensure that they bear good for the public, for the people at large, and that's part of the process and function of public policy. And so the way forward will continue, perhaps looking at what Zamchia referred to as a transitional democratic development fund for both Zimbabwe and South Africa. It seeks to look at the land question, the land issue, in a holistic manner, in the context of holistic, of attending to the developmental issues of a country. So, on that note, I thank you again. Once a night. Thank you very much, my dear. Then, Professor Mandi, Moyo, and Jezra Zamchia, thank you very much. Thank you all. We'll meet you again in a fortnight time. Please send your suggestions as what you think we should discuss next. I'd like to focus more on the economic issues, beginning with the land issue, but I think maybe we should move to the issue of trade and development and such questions that are pertinent in our region. Thank you very much and good night.